This story took place in Sweden and drew attention to long-standing problems. Saga Elneborg, the main character, was only 20 years old and 7 months pregnant. She had been dating her boyfriend, Mahmadin Ibrahim, whom she called Amin, for about 2 years. He was the father of her unborn child. The couple was eagerly awaiting the birth of a boy who, according to doctors, was perfectly healthy. Saga carefully prepared for motherhood. She set up a nursery, bought necessary items, and did special exercises. The pregnancy brought her true joy. Throughout this time, she kept a kind of online diary, posting photos of her growing belly and purchases for the baby. She especially enjoyed sharing pictures of tiny clothes. Saga's mother, Melissa, regularly visited her daughter to help out. On Sunday, April 28, Saga planned to spend time alone with her beloved. However, lately, more and more disagreements had been arising in their relationship, so Amin visited his pregnant girlfriend less often. That day, Saga told her mother that he was going to stop by, so Melissa decided not to interfere with their conversation. Saga was a charming, vibrant personality, a kind and well-mannered girl. At school, she had many friends and easily got along with people. The heroine dreamed of starting a family and having children, and thanks to her attractiveness, she had many admirers. Therefore, Melissa was surprised to see Amin on the doorstep of her home. Saga's family was wary of her relationship with a boy from a different culture. They understood that difficulties might arise when it came to meeting his family, especially after their daughter began to describe the problems in their relationship in detail. Despite this, Saga was full of enthusiasm and optimism. She loved Amin and wanted to preserve their relationship. However, it bothered her that he constantly hid her from his parents, which often led to arguments between the couple. Around 1 p.m. on April 29, 2023, Melissa Elneborg arrived at Saga's apartment in a residential complex in the city of Örebro, about 100 kilometers from Stockholm. She was going to help her daughter and pick up some things that had accumulated in anticipation of her grandson. When the woman arrived at the building, she was talking on the phone with her other daughter. Melissa rang the doorbell, but no one answered. She tried a few more times, but to no avail. It seemed strange to her. Melissa knocked, then used the intercom, called and texted Saga, but still received no response. The woman assumed that her daughter had simply forgotten about her arrival and went out on an errand. However, Melissa had a spare key and could enter the apartment without Saga's knowledge. She simply did not want to disturb the young couple. When she approached the door to unlock it, it turned out that the lock was already open. This seemed extremely suspicious to her. Saga was always very careful and locked the doors, even if she was going out for just a minute to pick up mail or go down to the laundry room. She would never leave the apartment unlocked. Once inside, Melissa heard running water in the kitchen. She ran there and turned off the faucet, calling for her daughter, but there was no answer. In the next room, the woman noticed something unusual. When she turned on the light, Melissa screamed in horror. She saw Saga lying on the floor lifeless. The girl was pale, her face covered by disheveled hair. A cord from a table lamp lay nearby, but the most terrifying thing was that a heavy table had pinned Saga's throat with its edge. Melissa rushed to her daughter, pushed the table aside, and removed the cord from her neck. Then she called an ambulance and began performing CPR on Saga. The woman immediately noticed that her daughter's body was already cold and her skin was icy. It seemed that Saga had been dead for quite some time. Paramedics arrived quickly but, as expected, could only pronounce the young woman and her unborn child dead. The police who arrived at the scene examined the apartment and the body. Saga had injuries to her head and face, covered in dried blood and matted hair. There were no obvious signs of a struggle in the home, but some furniture was scattered, jewelry boxes overturned, and their contents strewn across the floor. However, no traces of a break-in were found, so the detectives initially even considered the possibility of suicide. But thanks to Melissa's testimony and a check of the data from the victim's cell phone, it was established that Saga could not have taken her own life. She had no mental disorders or problems. On the contrary, the girl was full of life and happiness, especially since becoming pregnant. She was eagerly awaiting the birth of her child and would never have killed herself and the baby. Forensic experts collected several fingerprint samples, blood, DNA from under the victim's nails, and furniture at the crime scene for further analysis. The coroner determined that the cause of Saga's death was strangulation, and the time of death fell between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Not only the body of the 20-year-old mother was brought in for autopsy, but also a boy weighing 1.7 kilograms. The autopsy and analyses showed that the baby was completely healthy. These findings only fueled Melissa's anger, who demanded just retribution for the murderer. The tragedy came as a real shock to Saga's mother, the entire family, and friends. No one could believe that such a brutal criminal, capable of such a bloody massacre, had been close to the girl. Saga was too far removed from the criminal world for her life to end so tragically. The detectives immediately started the investigation by talking to the victim's relatives. Of course, the first person they questioned was Melissa, the heroine's mother. The woman said that on April 28, Saga was going to meet with several friends at a restaurant. Melissa herself joined their company. She noticed that her daughter was nervous and constantly checking her phone. Saga seemed agitated and admitted that she was waiting for a message from her boyfriend. Saga shared that her beloved had finally decided to tell his parents about their relationship. At the same time, he was very worried that they would not accept the fact that the girl was already 7 months pregnant and the couple had not officially married. The story's heroine confided that Amin was extremely concerned about this issue and was even on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He was almost certain that his parents would condemn their relationship. After all, they were Somalis, professed Islam, and held extremely conservative views. Saga, on the other hand, was a Swedish citizen, half Thai, half European by origin, and adhered to modern values. Her boyfriend, along with his family, had come to the country as refugees when Amin was still very young. In fact, the boy grew up in Europe, had more progressive thinking than his family, but still respected their traditions. It was also a major problem that Amin's relatives were Muslims, while Saga came from a Christian family. Due to such differences in worldviews and customs, conflicts often flared up between the lovers, and their relationship was quite tense. After dinner at the restaurant, Saga said goodbye to her mother and friends. They wished her luck, not even suspecting that they were seeing the girl alive for the last time. It later turned out that, after returning home, Saga was murdered. Investigators suggested that Amin might have had time to share information about his relationship with the girl with his family. This likely caused an outburst of aggression in them, which led to the tragedy. Therefore, in the early stages of the investigation, the possible involvement of Amin's relatives in the crime was considered. Suspicion fell on the behavior of the boy's mother, who left the house late in the evening. But later it was established that the woman had simply gone to the store and returned about 15 minutes later. No evidence was found that Amin's relatives were in any way involved in the murder. The boy's mother also aroused suspicion due to her hostile attitude towards her son. Once she found out that the car Amin was using was parked near Saga's house. At that point, the family already suspected that the young man was dating a Christian woman. After the car incident, the furious mother wrote to Amin that he was no longer a welcome guest in her home. The woman believed that if her son neglected traditions, it was easier to disown him. In response, the boy insisted that he had not even entered Saga's house, and eventually managed to convince his own mother of this, although it was not easy for him. Melissa recounted that from the very beginning of the pregnancy, the couple's relationship deteriorated. Rumor had it that Amin insisted on an abortion, fearing a negative reaction from his relatives. Despite this, the girl decided to keep the baby. Saga stated that if necessary, she could raise the child on her own. Back in the fall, in October, she shared the news of her pregnancy with her family. Everyone was happy about it, including Saga herself. However, at that time the lovers were on the verge of breaking up. The girl often complained that her boyfriend's culture was so different from what was customary in Sweden that it would be difficult for them to find common ground if Amin did not change his views. However, a few months later, the situation seemed to have improved. The young man adapted to Saga's lifestyle and accepted her pregnancy. He even showed joy about the upcoming fatherhood. Shortly after that, the girl moved to a new apartment. She decided to rent a more spacious place with a separate room for the baby and started furnishing it. By March 2023, the couple was still together, but troubling signs began to appear. Once a woman named Diana approached Saga and secretly told her that Amin had tried to persuade her to attack the pregnant girl. He insisted that it was necessary to hit Saga in the stomach several times to provoke a miscarriage. Upon hearing this, the heroine made a scene with her boyfriend, but he denied everything, calling Diana's words a lie. Melissa learned about these horrible things but did not want to believe them. However, now that she had found her daughter dead, this information started to make sense. The investigation set out to reconstruct the chronology of events on the eve of the tragedy. It was quickly established that on April 27, Amin and Saga planned to spend the evening together. However, it seemed that the boy was deliberately avoiding meeting his beloved, staying late at work. That evening, Saga gave him an ultimatum. She insisted that Amin must tell his family about their relationship, confess that he was innocent, and also inform them about the girl's relocation and pregnancy. Otherwise, they would break up. On April 28, the young people were at work, but they actively corresponded in messengers all day. Saga was eagerly awaiting news from Amin. Melissa noted that during that period, her daughter was very restless and extremely nervous. Obviously, this was due to the heated communication with her boyfriend. Detectives thoroughly examined the victim's cell phone. It was confirmed that intense correspondence between the lovers continued until 11 p.m. on April 28. At 11:15 p.m., Amin stated that he was not going to tell his parents about Saga and their romance. He claimed that his family was more important to him than an out-of-wedlock child. This decision clearly saddened and disappointed the girl, but she continued to persuade the boy to take this step. Saga argued that when they parted ways, his relatives would find out anyway, as she intended to demand financial support from him for raising the baby. Ultimately, during that correspondence, the young couple agreed that Amin would confess about Saga and their unborn child to his family. The boy replied that he was so worried that his heart was about to jump out of his chest. It was his last message to his beloved. Some time after that, the girl was killed. According to investigators, Saga's persistence and the risk that she might talk to Amin's parents herself gave him a serious motive for the attack. In fact, the young man was the only suspect in this case. He was brought in for questioning. The 22-year-old man denied his involvement in the crime. According to him, on the evening when the murder took place, he went to his family to tell them about his relationship with Saga. But geolocation data indicated that this was not true. In reality, Amin had headed to his girlfriend's apartment. Interestingly, at first, they did not even tell him what had happened to Saga. During the interrogation, the boy behaved strangely. He was too calm, even joked with the police officers. When they told him the address of the apartment where Saga's body was found, Amin did not even change his expression. It seemed as if he was pretending not to know the address. When investigators told Amin that he was the main suspect in the murder, he switched to a defensive position. The boy claimed that he was not responsible for what had happened and had an alibi. According to him, at the time of Saga's murder, he was driving with a friend. However, the mentioned friend was allegedly talking on the phone with someone else and refused to testify in Amin's favor. Despite the failure of the alibi, the suspect continued to insist that he last saw the girl on the evening of April 27. However, this contradicted his earlier statements that he had never been to the apartment whose address he allegedly did not know. The suspect began to claim that he had visited Saga's apartment, where they discussed painful issues. In particular, it was about the need to open up to his parents. Saga, on the other hand, insisted that Amin move in with her so that the young couple could finally start a real family. However, as detectives found out, the boy never stayed overnight in his beloved's new home. He feared that his relatives would find out about his relationship. Amin repeatedly promised to arrange the move, but every time he needed to confirm his words with actions, he refused under various pretexts. Due to the young man's suspicious behavior, law enforcement officers decided to detain him and take him into custody until all the circumstances were clarified. Amin spent several months behind bars. Eventually, prosecutors were able to provide strong evidence of his guilt. The accusers were convinced that the available material was more than enough for success in court hearings. During the investigation, even specially trained dogs were used. With their help, it was confirmed that several pieces of evidence and traces belonged to the suspect. Amin's lawyer claimed that a dog could not be considered a reliable source of information and used as the main argument. But these were far from the only proofs of the boy's guilt. The DNA analysis results took the longest to wait for. When the examination removed all doubts, it became clear that the killer was Mahmadin. Investigators were able to convincingly prove that it was he who strangled his girlfriend with an electrical cord, wrapping it around her neck while Saga was half asleep. But, as the operatives believed, this was not enough for the criminal. He dragged the unconscious Saga to the floor and pulled a 30-kilogram table up to her. It seems that the murderer tried to knock it over on the victim's stomach to interrupt the pregnancy in this way. The girl resisted the attacker with all her might, so she was able to protect her unborn child with her own body, receiving a bruised thigh in the process. Then the killer decided to finish the massacre by pressing the tabletop against Saga's throat. The exhausted girl desperately fought for her life, suffocating under the weight of the massive object, but she could not throw it off. When Saga finally died, the tabletop remained on her neck, pinning her body to the floor. Later, a deep post-mortem imprint formed on her skin. After the brutal crime, Amin made a mess in the apartment, scattering things from several drawers. The defendant's lawyer even insisted that the girl had died at the hands of robbers who had stolen money and some household appliances. However, prosecutors considered the staging of the robbery an aggravating circumstance. After all, many of the missing items were later found in Amin's possession during searches. The boy, in turn, claimed that those were his personal belongings, as well as gifts from the girl. An important fact was also that under the victim's nails, experts found traces of Mahmadin's DNA. In addition, the coroner established that shortly before her death, Saga had sexual contact with her partner. Amin claimed that the intimacy occurred by mutual consent when the girl was still alive, literally a few days before the tragedy. Of course, the prosecution doubted the truthfulness of these statements. The accusers also drew the jury's attention to the numerous inconsistencies and outright lies that abounded in the suspect's testimony. Numerous biological traces of Amin were found in Saga's apartment, although at first, he claimed that he did not know the address at all and had never been there. Investigators managed to prove that a woman named Diana, who complained about the boy's threats, was telling the truth. Several alarming queries were found in his search history on his gadgets. In particular, the young man was interested in whether a kick to a pregnant woman's stomach could lead to the death of an unborn child. During the court hearings, prosecutors demonstrated numerous screenshots of correspondence between Saga and Amin, dating back to December 2022. It was then that the lovers' relationship began to deteriorate due to the girl's pregnancy. From the last messages that the young couple exchanged on April 28, it followed that Saga was trying in every way to encourage her beloved and urge him to confess to his parents about their romance. The girl was clearly pressuring Amin, which his lawyers repeatedly mentioned. However, this in no way justified the committed crime. The prosecutors were convinced that instead of going to his relatives, the suspect had visited his passion's apartment. He never intended to tell his family about Saga, he was too afraid of their reaction. But the girl backed him into a corner with her demands. So Amin brutally and cold-bloodedly dealt with her out of sheer fear of his parents. The killer's defender suggested that the DNA samples under the victim's nails could have been left there long ago, since the lovers had been together for some time. However, Melissa insisted that her daughter often took showers, especially during pregnancy. The mother even thought that Saga treated cleanliness too pedantically. So the girl definitely could not have remained unwashed for more than a day after her last meeting with Amin. It was obvious that before her death, she had managed to wash and change into fresh clothes. Accordingly, all the biological traces found on her body ended up there directly during the attack. Strangely, immediately after Saga's death, her boyfriend deleted the girl from all his social networks and messengers, and also erased their correspondence for the last few days. It became clear to the detectives that in this way, he was trying to hide his involvement in the crime. However, the lost data was restored without effort, replenishing the already considerable amount of evidence against the suspect. Although there was a lack of direct evidence of Amin's guilt, his behavior clearly indicated that Saga's fate was indifferent to him. Investigators managed to find out that around 8 p.m. on the day of the tragedy, Mahmadin was near his girlfriend's apartment building. The boy was sitting in the car at a distance and continued to correspond, not driving closer or leaving. As if he was waiting for something. Perhaps at this time, he was trying to muster up the courage to attack, or he wanted to make sure that Saga was sound asleep. Then there was a sharp lull. As it turned out, from midnight to 2 in the morning, Amin's mobile phone was not used. That night, the suspect's friend, Samir, could not get through to his comrade. The young man ignored the call because his phone was in airplane mode. The signal from the mobile was recorded in the same residential complex where Saga had recently moved. This detail revealed another discrepancy in Mahmadin's testimony. After all, according to him, all that time he was supposedly at home with his parents. The killer's phone came to life only at 2:06 a.m. Interestingly, this very time is indicated in the coroner's report as the probable moment of death of the young mother and her unborn child. During the investigation, the defendant's versions changed several times. At some point, he began to claim that a whole gang of robbers was operating in Saga's home. As Amin confessed, he left a bag with a large sum of money in the girl's house. However, he never explained where he got these funds from. The man claimed that the attackers broke into the apartment for the purse with cash. Allegedly, Saga tried to prevent the thieves and paid with her life for it. However, the prosecution easily refuted these statements. After all, no signs of forcible entry were found at the crime scene. It was obvious that the victim herself opened the door to the killer. Or he had his own key to the apartment, which also fully corresponded to Mahmadin's capabilities. During the 9 months spent in pre-trial detention, the accused never admitted his guilt. He categorically denied any involvement in the tragedy. But during this time, prosecutors managed to gather a solid evidence base, supported by both direct and indirect facts. Despite Amin's stubbornness, he still did not renounce his words that he was afraid to tell his relatives about his relationship with Saga. He claimed that he sincerely loved the girl and even the child she was expecting. But the young man was convinced that his family would certainly disown him because of the shame. And indeed, these fears were fueled by stark differences in religion, outlook on life, and cultural traditions between the young couple. Later, the defendant even admitted that his parents' worldview was so orthodox that, in their opinion, he had no right to date a girl of European origin. After listening to the arguments of the prosecution and defense, the jury went to the deliberation room on June 9, 2024. The panel's verdict was unanimous. Mahmadin Ibrahim was guilty of the premeditated murder of Saga Elneborg. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, even after the announcement of the verdict, the young man continued to claim that he loved his chosen one and their unborn son. Allegedly, he never even thought of harming his loved ones. Amin insisted that violence was not at all in his nature, and the incriminated crime was the first and only criminal episode in his life. At the same time, the investigation managed to establish that during the 2 years of the relationship with the victim, the killer repeatedly cheated on her with other women. Despite his assurances of chastity, it turned out that Amin regularly made new acquaintances with persons of the opposite sex and often entered into intimate relationships with them. These revelations added dark colors to the image of the defendant, which his lawyer diligently tried to whitewash. The defender stood to the end on the fact that his client was innocent. They claimed that Saga died at the hands of a random robber. The defense counsel stated his intention to fight for Amin's freedom and readiness to appeal the verdict in the appellate court. The complaint was filed immediately after the announcement of the court's decision, but time will tell what result it will affect. Despite the guilty verdict for the murder of Saga Elneborg, the death of her unborn child during the attack was not separately qualified. This greatly outraged the relatives of the deceased, because in fact, the death of the baby was simply ignored. That's all for now. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Give this video a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any future content. Take care and goodbye.